The wind screamed across the face of the mountain, tearing at the jagged cliffs like an angry spirit. Far above the valley floor, where the air was thin and the sky seemed within reach, a massive nest clung to a ledge carved by centuries of ice and wind. It was built of thick branches, lined with soft down plucked from the chest of its maker. Inside lay 2 eggs, precious fragile ovals of life sheltered beneath the warm feathered body of a golden eagle hen. She had guarded them for weeks, her eyes scanning the sky for threats, ravens, hawks, and the ever-daring pine marten that sometimes ventured high for a meal. Her mate, a fierce male with a wingspan that could shadow the rocks below, had been her partner for years. They had raised chicks here before, and though nature was cruel, they had always triumphed. But on this night, nature was not merely cruel, it was merciless. A storm rolled in without warning, black clouds poured over the mountain peaks like an avalanche of shadow, and the wind shifted from a gentle whisper to a roaring howl. The temperature plummeted, and sleet began to lash against the cliffs, rattling the nest's sturdy walls. The female tightened her grip on the branches, tucking her body closer over the eggs, shielding them with her wings. In the distance, a piercing cry echoed, a sound of alarm. Her mate was returning, fighting the storm's fury. She saw his silhouette against a flash of lightning, wings straining as he struggled toward her. But something was wrong. His flight was uneven, and she spotted the dark streaks of blood along his chest. A peregrine falcon, desperate for territory, had attacked him earlier that day. The fight had been fierce, and though he had driven the smaller bird away, he had taken wounds in the process. He landed heavily on the edge of the nest, his talons scraping the rock. His breath came in short bursts, and his eyes, usually sharp and commanding, were clouded with pain. She nuzzled him briefly, but there was no time for comfort. The wind was building into a force that could strip the nest from the cliffside. Then came the crack. A dead branch, part of the nest's foundation, snapped under the strain. The nest tilted, and one of the eggs began to roll. The female lunged, catching it just in time, but in her movement, the other eager pale shell with faint brown speckles slipped toward the edge. She struck at it with her beak, trying to pull it back, but the wind caught it, and with a sickening inevitability, it toppled over the rim. She let out a screamer, raw, aching sound that vanished into the storm. Somewhere far below, the egg tumbled through the darkness, bouncing off jagged rocks before coming to rest in a tangle of branches halfway down the cliff face. It should have ended there. A fall like that was a death sentence for an unhatched chick, but fate had its own design. The egg lay wedged in the crook of a broken pine, rocked gently by the wind. Hours passed, the storm raged on, and above, the mother fought desperately to keep the remaining egg safe. By dawn, the male eagle could no longer stand. He collapsed in the nest, his eyes closing for the last time. The female, her feathers ragged and wet, crouched over the surviving egg, mourning silently. She never knew that the lost egg had survived. Down in the lower reaches of the cliff, the forest stirred with morning life. A family of crows, clever, opportunistic, and ever curious, discovered the pale oval nestled in the pine. The largest of them, a matriarch with missing tail feathers from some long-forgotten battle, hopped closer. She pecked gently at the shell, tilting her head. Inside, faint movement answered her curiosity. She could have left it. Crows were scavengers, and a broken egg meant an easy meal. But something stayed her hunger. Perhaps it was the instinct that sometimes crossed species, recognition of life struggling to begin. She croaked softly, and 2 younger crows joined her. Together, they pushed and rolled the egg toward their nest, hidden in the thick limbs of a nearby spruce. Days passed. The egg rocked with the warmth of its new caretakers. The matriarch fed herself less to keep the egg warm, draping her wings over it when the cold nights came. Finally, one morning, the shell cracked. A tiny beak poked through, followed by a head covered in wet, patchy down. The chick was awkward, an alien larger than any crow hatchling, with legs too long and a voice that squealed rather than cawed, but it was alive. The crows fed it scraps, bits of beetle, torn pieces of fruit, and the occasional worm. It grew quickly, its wings stretching farther each day, and yet, even from the start, it was clear, this chick was not one of them. Its eyes held a piercing gold that no crow possessed. Its talons were curved like hooks, built for killing. Its wings, though still small, promised a span that would one day eclipse the largest crow. The other young crows accepted it with the unthinking openness of youth, but the adults kept their distance. It was a strange one, an oddity in their black-feathered world. The matriarch, though, stayed close. She taught it the ways of the flock, how to scavenge, how to hide from hawks, how to call for help. In her own way, she became its mother. Still, the young bird sometimes climbed to the topmost branches and stared upward, toward the sheer cliffs where it had come from. It didn't know why the sight of that wind-scoured rock made something in its chest ache. It didn't know that high above, in a nest now empty, the bones of its parents bleached slowly in the sun. It only knew that somewhere far beyond the forest canopy, the sky called to it. The young eagle, though it did not yet know its name, its kind, or the truth of its blood, grew fast. Within a few short moons, it had outgrown the other crow fledglings, its feathers molting from the soft gray down of infancy into sleek, dark brown plumage that gleamed faintly in the morning light. Its wings grew long and heavy, their span already wider than the eldest crow's. Its legs, thick and powerful, gripped branches with a force that sometimes snapped them clean. At first, the flock regarded its size as a curiosity. The younger crows would dart around it in games of chase, laughing in their high-pitched calls when it stumbled or flapped awkwardly. But as the seasons turned, curiosity soured into something else. It began with small things. When the flock gathered to feast on a squirrel carcass, the young eagle needed more food than the others. Its hunger was an annoying, constant thing, and it would pull at the meat with such force that the smaller crows had to hop back or risk losing a toe. Whispered complaints rose among the adults' complaints that the matriarch ignored, but could not silence. Then came the matter of its voice. When danger approached, a hawk's shadow passing over the trees, the crows called out in a sharp, unified caw-caw, their alarm filling the air. The young eagle tried to join them, but what burst from its throat was not a caw but a piercing scream. So raw and shrill it startled even its own flockmate. The first time it happened, the others stared at it in frozen silence. Then, one by one, they began to chuckle low at first, then loud and cruel. "You sound broken," one of the younger males taunted, "like a crow choking on a bone." The words stung, though the young eagle didn't understand why. It only knew that every time it opened its beak after that, it saw the flicker of smirks and the knowing glances exchanged. By the time its first winter came, the differences were impossible to ignore. The young eagle's wings carried it higher and farther than the others, almost without effort. On clear days, it would rise above the treetops, feeling the rush of cold wind under its feathers, the world falling away beneath it. Up there, in the thin air, something inside it felt right, like it had been made for this height, this freedom. But the crows saw this as arrogance. "Too good to stay with us on the ground, is that it?" sneered an older male one afternoon when the eagle returned from a long, solitary flight. "Flying up there doesn't make you one of the falcons. You're still just a strange, ugly crow." The insults grew bolder. They mocked its size, its talons, its awkward landings. They laughed when branches bent under its weight, or when its powerful wings stirred up gusts that knocked the others off balance. The young eagle, unsure of itself, tried harder to fit in, flying low, perching where they perched, mimicking their calls. But no matter how much it tried, the whispers never stopped. And the worst part was the doubt. What if they were right? What if it was nothing, neither crow nor anything else? One bleak winter morning, the flock set out to scavenge near the river, where fish sometimes washed ashore in the ice. The young eagle, eager to please, arrived first. Spotting the silvery glint of a half-frozen trout trapped between two rocks, it swooped down, talons slicing the air, and with a single pull, yanked the fish free. Pride swelled in its chest as it turned to offer the catch to the others, but the response was not gratitude. Instead, a ring of crows formed around it, their black eyes glittering with disdain. "Look at those claws," one muttered. "Not made for sharing. Too big, too greedy." Another chimed in. The young eagle set the fish down and stepped back, but the words kept coming, each sharper than the last. "Face it," said the old male, his voice loud enough to carry over the wind. "You're not one of us. You never were. You're nothing." The word echoed in its mind. Nothing, 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 as the flock descended on the fish, tearing it apart while it stood on the edge of the group, wings drooping. That night, the young eagle roosted alone on a high branch, apart from the others. The moonlight spilled over its feathers, catching the faint golden hue beginning to emerge beneath the brown. It stared up at the sky, past the drifting clouds, into the black infinity beyond. Somewhere out there, it thought, there must be others like me. It didn't know why it believed this, only that the thought filled it with a strange mixture of longing and fear. For the first time, the idea of leaving the flock flickered in its mind. It didn't yet have the courage, but the seed had been planted. And seeds, once planted, have a way of growing. Winter began to loosen its grip on the forest. The snow still clung stubbornly to the shadows, but in the open meadows, thin blades of grass poked through the frost. The river, once locked under ice, now sang again. its waters glinting like molten silver beneath the pale sun. The young eagle, though it still thought of itself as nothing more than an odd crow, had taken to wandering alone. The jabs and taunts of the flock had driven it further from the group, and the solitude, while cold and heavy, was at least quiet. It would fly low over the forest canopy, skimming the treetops, then circle down to the open fields to watch the deer move like silent ghosts between the shadows. Something about the world beyond the flock's territory called to it, a quiet pull it couldn't explain. The cry in the sky, it happened one clear afternoon. The air was crisp, the kind of day when sound carries far. The eagle had climbed to its favorite perch, an ancient pine that stood taller than the rest, its top swaying gently in the wind. From here it could see the wide valley, the river cutting through it like a silver snake, and beyond that the mountains. That was when it heard it. A cry, sharp, piercing, and unlike any it had ever known, split the air. It was not the caw of a crow, nor the scream of a hawk. This sound was deeper, wilder, filled with something that made the feathers along its neck stand on end. It looked up, far above, riding the wind with impossible grace. A massive bird was circling. Its wings seemed to stretch forever, each beat slow and powerful, the kind of movement born not from struggle but from mastery. The sunlight caught its feathers, and they burned gold and bronze against the blue sky. The young eagle froze. Every instinct inside it screamed recognition, though its mind didn't understand why. That curve of the wings, that proud tilt of the head, the way the air seemed to bow beneath its flight, it was like looking at something half forgotten yet deeply known. For a long moment, it simply stared upward, the world below forgotten. A shadow over the valley, the great bird shifted in the air, banking toward the mountains. As it turned, its shadow swept across the valley, sliding over the trees, the rocks, and finally, across the young eagle's perch. The moment that shadow touched it, a strange fire lit in its chest. It was a feeling both exhilarating and painful, like a door had been flung open inside, revealing a room it had never known existed. The crows had told it many things over the months. That it was clumsy, that it was ugly, that it didn't belong. And here, in the presence of that golden-winged stranger, all those words felt small and false. The massive bird let out another cry, a sound that seemed to slice through the thin air and lodge itself deep in the young eagle's heart. Then, with a final sweep of its wings, it vanished into the clouds above the distant peaks. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. A restless night that night. The young eagle could not sleep. The flock had roosted in their usual grove, but it had chosen a solitary branch on the forest's edge, staring at the mountains until the stars blurred in its vision. The stranger's image replayed in its mind again and again. The way the light had caught its feathers, the way it had seemed utterly at home in the sky. The young eagle thought of its own flight, short bursts, awkward landings, always under the watchful eyes of those who judged it. But what if it could fly like that, high enough to touch the clouds, strong enough to let the wind carry it for miles without effort? It felt a tug in its chest, a longing so sharp it was almost pain. The decision begins to form by dawn. The longing had transformed into something else. A question. What if there were more like the golden bird? What if it was not a freak, not a mistake, but simply misplaced? The thought was dangerous. The forest was all it had ever known. Beyond it lay unknown valleys, predators, storms, hunger, but staying meant shrinking into a life that no longer fit. For the first time, the young eagle looked at the mountains, not with fear, but with a quiet certainty. Somewhere beyond them, it felt, was an answer. And answers are worth chasing, no matter the risk. The decision was not made in a single moment, but rather in 100 small ones. A week after seeing the golden-winged giant in the sky, the young eagle began to notice things it had ignored before. The trees felt smaller, the flock's territory narrower. The calls of the crows no longer stirred comfort only. The sense of a cage, invisible but suffocating. It found itself lingering at the forest's edge, staring toward the open valley, imagining what lay beyond the ridges. Every time it returned to the flock, the jeers and sideways glances felt heavier. The seed planted by that glimpse of destiny had begun to grow roots. The last day with the flock. It was early spring when the final push came. The morning air carried the scent of thawing earth, and the river's voice was louder with the rush of melting snow. The flock had gathered to pick at the remains of a deer carcass left by wolves. The young eagle approached cautiously, remembering too many cold stares. As it stepped toward the kill, an older male blocked its path. Feathers flared. "Back off," he growled. "You eat too much. Always have." "I can help," the eagle said, though the words were more instinct than speech. A low trill and click in the crow's own dialect, but the others were already shifting, closing ranks against it. Help. The male gave a sharp laugh. Help yourself. You mean, go on, find your own scraps. Outsider. The word struck harder than claws. Outsider. It had been whispered before, but this time it was spoken plainly, with the weight of a verdict. The young eagle backed away, hunger gnawing in its belly, but something else gnawing deeper. The realization that no matter what it did, it would never belong here. A night of wind and resolve that night. The wind came down from the mountains, cold and sharp. The young eagle roosted alone in the tall pine at the forest's edge, the stars glinting hard above. It thought of the golden giant again, of the shadow that had swept across it like a blessing, of the cry that had lit a fire in its chest. If it stayed, that fire would die. If it left, it might die before ever finding what it sought. Both paths carried pain, but one carried a chance, just a chance of finding the truth. By the time the first blush of dawn touched the sky, the choice was made. Farewell without goodbye. There was no ceremony, no announcement. The young eagle knew no one would care enough to watch it go except perhaps the old matriarch who had once sheltered it. But she was nowhere to be seen that morning, and maybe that was for the best. It stretched its wings, feeling the unfamiliar weight of decision. The air was still cool and damp with night, perfect for flight. With a single bound, it launched from the branch, wings beating hard until the ground dropped away. The forest spread beneath it like a dark sea. The familiar trees shrank, and beyond them lay the valley vast, open, and brimming with promise and threat alike. Into the unknown the first hours were exhilarating. The wind carried the eagle farther than it had ever flown before, and with each mile, the knot in its chest loosened. It passed over meadows where elk grazed, over streams that glittered like ribbons of glass. But the world beyond the forest was harsher than it had imagined. By midday, the thermals shifted, the wind turned against it, and the open sky became a battlefield. Gusts slammed into its wings, forcing it lower, until it was skimming the tops of jagged rocks. Hunger soon followed. The crow's scavenger tricks were useless here. No communal feeding, no half-eaten kills. It spotted a field mouse once, diving awkwardly, but missed. By nightfall, its stomach ached, and the ache in its wings was worse. It roosted that night in a bare wind-blasted tree at the base of a mountain. The forest it had left now only a dark smudge on the horizon. The mountain's test. The next day brought rain-cold, unrelenting sheets that stung its eyes and soaked its feathers until they clung heavy to its body. The mountains loomed ahead, their peaks lost in cloud. Climbing them was not a matter of choice. It was the only way forward. The higher it flew, the thinner the air became, and the more its muscles screamed in protest. At one point, a sudden updraft nearly slammed it into a cliff wall. Its talons scraped rock, finding purchase just in time. It clung there, heart hammering, the wind howling like some ancient predator. And yet, hanging from that cliffside, the eagle felt something unexpected. Exhilaration. The wind was no longer just an enemy, it was a force to be understood, shaped, ridden. It pushed off again, this time letting the gust lift it rather than fighting. Slowly, painfully, it began to climb. A glimpse of gold on the third day. As it neared the high passes, the clouds thinned for a moment. Through a gap in the mist, far above, it saw it again, a speck of gold against the white sky. The massive bird it had seen weeks before, gliding effortlessly along the ridge. It tried to call out, but the wind tore the sound away. By the time it had found its balance, the golden figure had vanished into the clouds. Still, the sight was enough. The choice to leave had not been foolish. The path was hard, but it was leading somewhere. The first realization, that night perched on a narrow ledge with the moon painting silver on the snow, the young eagle realized something profound. It was no longer a crow, it never had been, and the world ahead was wide enough for it to become whatever it truly was. The mountains were a place of silence and storms. Days passed in a blur of wind, snow, and endless stone. The young eagle's wings had grown sore from the constant climb, its talons raw from gripping jagged perches. Food was scarce, just the occasional vole or a scrap of carrion found half buried in the snow. Yet the hunger in its belly was nothing compared to the hunger in its heart. That golden shadow it had seen twice now haunted every waking moment. Somewhere out here, it knew, was the answer to the question that had been burning inside it since the day it left the forest. The voice on the wind. It was just after dawn on the 7th day in the mountains. The clouds had pulled back, revealing a pale blue sky. The young eagle stood on a cliff edge, scanning the valleys below, when a sound reached its ears. Not the chatter of crows, not the scream of a hawk. It was a cry deep, resonant, and commanding. It rolled through the air like thunder, carrying with it a presence that made every muscle in the young eagle's body tighten. It looked up. There, emerging from behind a peak, was the golden giant. Sunlight caught the elder's feathers, turning them to molten bronze. Its wings spanned wider than any bird the young eagle had ever seen, each beat slow and assured. The great bird rode the air as if it were part of it, every movement a language the wind understood. The young eagle's heart hammered. It launched itself into the air without thinking, angling upward, desperate to close the distance. The first encounter the golden giant noticed. With a single sweep of its wings, it circled lower, meeting the young eagle halfway. When they were close enough for the younger to see the deep amber of the elder's eyes, the great bird let out another cry, not of challenge, but of acknowledgement. The young eagle's landing was clumsy. Its talons scraped against the rock, nearly sending it over the edge. But the elder caught its gaze and waited patiently until it steadied itself. "You have flown far," the elder said, not in words as humans know them, but in the silent speech of their kind, a blend of sound, posture, and the deep language carried in the wind between wingbeats. "I've been looking for you," the young eagle answered in the same unspoken tongue, though awkwardly, as if speaking it for the first time. "I know," the elder replied, his eyes soft yet piercing. "I saw you once, in the valley. I wondered then if you would find your way here." The name of the sky. The elder introduced himself as Aquila, a name that meant sky guardian in the speech of the eagles. He was older than any eagle the young one could imagine, yet his wings showed no sign of weakness. "You are not Crow," Aquila said, studying the younger bird with quiet certainty. "You never were. You are Aquila Crescitosa, golden eagle, born to the high places, built for the hunt, ruler of the air." The words struck the young eagle with the force of lightning. All the years of mockery, of feeling wrong in its own feathers, began to shift in its mind. There had been nothing wrong with it had simply been living the wrong life. "But I don't know how to be that," it admitted, lowering its head. "That," Aquila said, "is why I am here." The first lessons training began the very next day. The first lesson was wind. Aquila taught that to fight the wind was to waste strength. To ride it was to gain power without effort. They soared together, the elder demonstrating how to tilt the wings, how to feel the shift of air before it happened, how to use an updraft to climb without a single beat. The second lesson was sight. "Your eyes," Aquila said, "can see farther than you believe, not just shapes, details, the flick of a tail in the grass, the ripple of a fish beneath the water's skin, the movement that tells you where to strike before your prey even knows you are there." The young eagle struggled at first. Its landings were still clumsy, and more than once it misjudged the wind, ending in an undignified tumble. But Aquila never mocked. He only corrected, then made the younger try again. The test of the rabbit. On the fifth day, Aquila set the first true challenge. They circled high above a meadow where a snowshoe hare darted between patches of white and brown. "Take it," Aquila instructed. "Show me you can hunt as your blood demands." The young eagle dove, folding its wings close, the air screaming past its ears. It struck the ground hard, talons slashing, but the hare twisted away at the last instant, vanishing into the brush. Panting, frustrated, the young eagle climbed back to where Aquila waited. The elder did not scold. "You missed because you struck where it was, not where it would be. Patience. See with more than your eyes." They hunted again the next day. This time, the young eagle watched longer, tracing the hare's pattern of movement, feeling the rhythm in its hops. When it struck, it did so at the moment the hare was about to leap, and its talons closed around warm fur. It carried the kill back to the rocks where Aquila waited. The elder's nod was small but full of pride. "Now," he said, "you begin. A place among the clouds, weeks passed in the high country." The young eagle's wings grew stronger, its dives swifter, its vision sharper. It learned to snatch fish from icy streams, to ride storms instead of fleeing them, to defend itself from other predators. More than skill, it learned a truth. It had never been broken. It had simply been unfinished. Each night, as it roosted beside Aquila on the cliff's edge, watching the moon silver the snow, it felt the old shame fading. In its place was something new, a sense of belonging that went deeper than any flock it had ever known. The mountains in early spring could change their face in the span of a heartbeat. One morning might dawn golden and clear, the air calm enough for a feather to drift unbroken from a cliff's edge to the valley floor. By afternoon, black clouds could spill over the ridges like a dark tide, turning the sky into a churning ocean of wind and ice. It was on such a day that the young eagle's greatest trial arrived. The morning began quietly. Aquila had taken the young eagle to a high peak where the thermals were strong, perfect for practicing long glides. The air was crisp and bright, and far below, a herd of mountain goats picked their way along a rocky slope. But Akila's eyes kept returning to the western horizon. "Storm," the elder said in their silent wingborne language. His gaze was fixed on the advancing wall of cloud, a bruise-colored mass rolling toward them, not a passing one. "This will break the peaks." The young eagle glanced at the clouds, but felt little fear. They had flown in bad weather before. Yet the weight in Akila's voice planted a knot of unease in its chest. The cry for help, then, a sound cut through the wind, a high, frantic screech. Both eagles turned toward the source. Far below, in a craggy outcrop near the valley floor, a fledgling clung to the edge of a nest barely the size of a saddle. Its wings flailed helplessly against the rising gusts. The nest swayed, built too precariously close to the cliff's lip. Its parents were nowhere in sight. "They won't make it back before the storm hits," Akila said grimly. "That chick will be torn from the rock before nightfall." The young eagle's heart thudded. Without thinking, it spread its wings. "Then I'll bring it up." Akila's eyes narrowed. "The wind will tear you apart down there. You've never flown in a storm like this." "I can do it," the younger insisted. It wasn't just bravado, it was a fierce certainty. The same fire that had pushed it to leave the crows, to climb the mountains, to survive. "I have to try." The elder studied it for a long moment, then dipped his head once. "Then listen well. The wind is not your enemy, but it will kill you if you do not respect it." Descent into fury. The young eagle dove. The air was already turning wild, gusts surging up the cliffs like invisible waves. Each shift threatened to slam it into the rock. It angled its wings as Aquila had taught, catching the currents when they helped, folding tight when they didn't. The fledgling's cries grew louder. The nest was shaking violently now, bits of twig snapping away into the void. The chick clung to the rim, eyes wide with terror. With a final burst, the young eagle landed beside it, talons gripping the slippery stone. The wind clawed at its feathers, nearly prying it loose. It folded one wing protectively around the chick and gripped tighter. The climb back, lifting off with the extra weight, was like trying to break free from the pull of the earth itself. The first push failed, dragging them back down. The second liftoff caught a sudden gust that almost ripped the chick from its grasp. On the third try, it found the rhythm, timing the wing beat with the rising surge of wind, letting the air itself help carry them upward. The climb was agony. Each meter upward felt stolen from the storm's grip. Icy pellets stung its eyes. Its muscles burned with effort. Below, the rocks blurred in the storm's chaos. Above, the cliff's edge seemed impossibly far. Then, through the swirling white, a shape emerged. Aquila, wings spread wide, riding the storm's fury like a master. The elder dove low, shielding them from the worst of the gusts, guiding them toward the peak. The return. They landed in a sheltered hollow, just as the storm broke in full. The wind roared like 1,000 rivers. Snow slashed sideways across the sky. The young eagle crouched over the chick, shielding it with its body, while Aquila stood guard at the entrance. For what felt like hours, the storm raged. But slowly, the winds eased, the snow thinned, and the first pale light of dawn broke through. The chick's parents arrived with desperate cries, sweeping the younger into their wings. They cast a glance, half awe, half gratitude, at the young eagle before retreating to safety. The elder's words when they were alone again. Aquila turned to the younger bird. His gaze was steady but softer than ever before. "You have strength," he said, "but today you showed something greater: courage that does not wait for safety, and skill that listens to the wind rather than fighting it." The young eagle lowered its head, both humbled and proud. "You are no longer a student," Aquila said. "You are a hunter of the high country. One of us." That night, as they roosted on a high cliff under a sky scrubbed clean by the storm, the young eagle felt a change inside. It had faced the mountain's fury and survived it for its own sake, but for another's, and in that it had earned something more than skill. It had earned a place in the sky. The storm had passed, but its mark remained on the mountains. Snow lay in thick drifts across the high ridges, and in the valleys below, broken branches and fallen nests told the story of the wind's wrath. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and the faint wild tints of melting ice. For the young eagle, the world felt different now. The rescue of the fledgling had changed more than its place in the flock. It had shifted the way it carried itself. Its wings no longer folded in uncertainty. Its eyes met the horizon with a steadiness that spoke of knowing where it belonged. Whispers on the windward of the rescue traveled quickly through the high country. Eagles were solitary by nature, but news moved with the wind, passed in brief encounters over hunting grounds, in the silent exchanges of wing-dept greetings. In the days that followed, the young eagle noticed something new. The glances from others held no mockery, no dismissal. Some even carried respect. Once, while circling above a glacier-fed lake, it crossed paths with a pair of seasoned hunters. Instead of turning away, they tilted their wings in salute before continuing on. It was a small gesture, but it settled deep in the young eagle's chest. The scarcity of spring in the mountains could be deceptive. Though the snow was retreating, prey was still scarce. Many streams remained frozen, and small mammals stayed hidden in their burrows. Hunger pressed hard on every winged hunter. It was during this time that the young eagle faced its first test as more than just a survivor, had to think beyond its own needs. While hunting in the low meadows, it spotted an old female eagle attempting to catch a hare. Her dive was clumsy, her left wing dragging slightly, an injury that made her flight uneven. The hare escaped easily, vanishing into a thicket. The younger bird had the hare in its talons minutes later. It could have kept it. Hunger gnawed at its belly. But instead, it carried the catch back to the ridge where the old eagle rested. She accepted the gift without a word, but the look in her eyes, tired but alight with gratitude, was something the young eagle would remember long after the meat was gone. Defending the high country, respect alone is never enough to keep a place in the mountains. It must be earned again and again. Not long after, trouble came in the form of a rival predator, massive northern goshawk that had begun to hunt too close to the eagle's nesting cliffs. It was fearless, striking at fledglings and stealing kills. The younger eagles kept their distance, unwilling to challenge it. The young eagle, however, would not stand by. With Aquila watching from above, it confronted the intruder in the open air. The goshawk was faster than any eagle, but the young eagle had learned from the wind itself. It climbed higher, forcing the hawk to follow, until the thinner air slowed its smaller wings. Then, with a controlled dive, it struck, driving the goshawk out of the territory. From that day, the high cliffs were safe again. Lessons in leadership. Aquila, ever watchful, began to speak more of things beyond flight and hunt. Strength, the elder said one evening, is not enough to lead. A leader carries the safety of others in their shadow. You must see farther than the hunt, see the seasons, the dangers, the paths others cannot. The young eagle listened, absorbing each word. Leadership, it learned, was not about command, it was about service, and the willingness to face danger first. A name earned by midsummer, the young eagle had become a constant presence in the high country. It led younger hunters to rich feeding grounds, warned of storms before they broke, and stood guard over the nesting cliffs when others were away. The fledgling it had once saved had grown stronger, often seen practicing dives in the sunlight. Sometimes it would follow the young eagle for hours, mimicking its movements. It was during one such flight that Aquila, watching from a nearby peak, spoke in the wind's language. You have earned your place, and your name. From this day, the mountains will know you as The name struck deep, not for the glory it carried, but for the truth it marked. The young eagle had faced the mountain's worst and returned stronger. On the edge of tomorrow, that night, Stormbreaker roosted alone on a high cliff. The valley spread out below like an ocean of shadow. The wind curled around its feathers, carrying the scents of pine, snow, and the far-off summer meadows. It knew the journey was far from over. Challenges would come, new storms, new rivals, and perhaps trials even greater than the one that had earned its name. But for the first time, Stormbreaker felt no doubt. It was not a lost fledgling anymore. It was not a crow nor a nameless outsider. It was an eagle of the high country, hunter, protector, and leader. And the sky, vast and endless, was waiting. The years in the high country passed, but time in the mountains is not measured by clocks or calendars. It is marked by the turning of seasons, the flight of shadows over snow, the rising and falling of rivers. Stormbreaker, once the nameless outcast, now ruled these skies as surely as the wind itself, the eagle of the dawn. Each morning, before the sun's first light touched the valley, Stormbreaker would rise from its cliff roost. It would leap into the cold air, wings catching the pale breath of night, and climb higher and higher until the land below became a quilt of mist and stone. From that height, it would watch the sun climb over the horizon, its light spilling across the peaks in molten gold. The mountains seemed to glow beneath it, as if bowing to their guardian. Hunters in the valley sometimes caught sight of it in those early hours, a vast shadow sweeping across the snowfields. They spoke of it in low voices. The eagle of the dawn, a spirit of the peaks who watched over the wild, guardian of the peaks. Stormbreaker had no crown, no throne, but it had a domain: the nesting cliffs, the alpine meadows, the glacial lakes. It defended them fiercely, not out of possession, but out of duty. When winter storms closed the passes, it guided younger eagles to sheltered valleys. When rival predators tested the boundaries, it drove them back. When the winds turned treacherous, it was the first to rise. scouting the currents and calling warnings in the sky's own language. It was not just a leader. Now it was the heartbeat of the high country. The return of the goshawk one spring, word reached Stormbreaker that the northern goshawk had returned. Older, meaner, and desperate, it had been driven from its hunting grounds farther north and was raiding nests again. Stormbreaker met it above the frozen river at dusk. The air was heavy with the scent of snowmalt, the light turning the water into a ribbon of silver fire. The goshawk struck first, faster than an arrow, but Stormbreaker had faced storms and lived. It climbed into the wind, forcing the hawk to follow, then banked sharply, catching the rival off guard. The battle was brief and decisive. The goshawk retreated into the shadows, never to return. That victory sealed Stormbreaker's place in the stories that would be told for years. Akila's farewell. By the time the first leaves began to turn gold, Akila's feathers had dulled, and his flights had grown shorter. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks, the elder took to the air for one last long glide. Stormbreaker followed, sensing without words what this was. They flew side by side, silent but connected in every beat of their wings. At a high ridge overlooking the valley where they had first met, Akila landed. "The sky is yours now," he said, his voice slow, like the settling of snow. "Guard it well." The next morning Aquila was gone. Whether he had flown into the far peaks or to some place beyond the world's edge, Stormbreaker never knew. But from that day on, it carried the elder's lessons in every flight. The making of a legend as seasons became years. Stormbreaker's deeds traveled beyond the mountains. Herders spoke of an eagle that broke storms and defended the flocks from wolves. Travelers told of a shadow that led them to safe passes through blizzards. Even the hunters who once feared eagles came to respect the one who never took more than the land could give. To the young eagles who rose from the cliffs each year, Stormbreaker was more than a leader. It was proof that origin does not define destiny, that even a life begun in loss can rise to the highest sky. The final flight one autumn morning, with the air sharp and the first snow dusting the peaks, Stormbreaker took to the air alone. It climbed higher than it ever had, the wind roaring like old friends in its feathers. From that height, the world stretched endless in every direction, mountains, valleys, rivers, all bathed in gold. It was as if the entire sky bowed in acknowledgement. Those who saw it that day say it disappeared into the sun itself, leaving only a single golden feather drifting down to the valley floor. Legas. Even now, when the wind howls over the peaks and the shadows race across the snow, the mountain folk will glance up and smile. Some say Stormbreaker still flies there, unseen, riding the thermals above the highest cliffs. Others believe it became the wind itself, forever watching, forever guarding. But all agree on one thing: the eagle's life was not defined by the storm that began it, but by the sky it claimed as its own. Years had passed since Stormbreaker vanished into the sun and returned as the undisputed ruler of the high country. The mountains knew its wings. The rivers sang in its shadow. But peace in the wild is never permanent. A new threat was coming, not from the sky, but from the ground. The change in the air, it began subtly. The herds of mountain goats moved lower earlier than usual. The marmots stayed hidden even when the midday sun was warm. Ravens, ever the opportunists, gathered in greater numbers, their black shapes wheeling over the lower slopes. Stormbreaker noticed these things as only a seasoned hunter can, small details, each unremarkable alone, but together whispering of trouble. One dawn, as it circled over the western valley, it saw them, shapes moving in the shadow of the cliffs. Wolves, a whole pack, larger than any it had seen before. Their coats were the color of ash, their bodies lean but strong, eyes glinting like chips of ice. They moved with purpose, claiming territory with silent confidence. The silent redditors. The wolves were no strangers to the high country, but this pack hunted differently. They did not linger in one place. They swept through the valleys like a storm front, driving prey ahead of them. Soon the meadows grew quiet. The lakes lay still with no deer to drink from them. Even the nesting cliffs felt emptier, mothers leaving their chicks for longer stretches, risking the cold to find food. Stormbreaker followed the wolves for days, watching from above. It saw them bring down an elk in the lower pass, their coordinated attack swift and merciless. It saw them raid the nesting grounds of geese, tearing apart eggs and hatchlings without hesitation. If left unchecked, they would strip the valleys bare before winter even began. The call for allies. Stormbreaker knew this was not a fight it could win alone. The wolves were too many, too fast, and so, for the first time since becoming leader, it called for allies. The call went out over the mountains, a long, spiraling cry that carried on the wind. Eagles came from distant ridges, some curious, some wary. Even a few hawks and falcons answered. drawn by the unusual summons. They gathered on the high cliffs as the sun bled into the horizon. Stormbreaker spoke in the language of the wind and the wild. The valley is under threat. If we do nothing, there will be nothing left to hunt when the snows come. Not all were convinced. Some cared only for their own hunting grounds, others feared the wolves' teeth more than hunger, but enough agreed to stand beside Stormbreaker to form a loose alliance. The battle for the valley. The plan was simple but dangerous. Stormbreaker and the swiftest flyers would harry the wolves from above, forcing them toward the narrow canyons where the heavier, stronger eagles could strike. Hawks and falcons would dive to scatter the wolves' formation, giving the larger birds a chance to attack from the rear. The first clash came at dawn 2 days later. The wolves were moving through a frost-covered meadow when the sky darkened with wings. Stormbreaker dove first, talons outstretched, striking the lead wolf across the muzzle. The beast snarled and stumbled, giving the others a moment to close ranks. Above, the hawks screamed down, slashing at the wolves' eyes and ears. The pack faltered under the sudden onslaught, but their leader, a massive gray with a scar over one eye, howled, rallying them. What followed was chaos. Wings beat against fur, snow and blood sprayed into the air, the cries of birds and the snarls of wolves mingling into a single battle song. Stormbreaker fought with precision, not just strength, striking where the wolves were weakest, keeping the formation broken. Finally, with a sharp command from their leader, the wolves turned and fled into the lower forests. The price of victory. The valley was safe for now, but the cost had been high. One young eagle lay on the snow, feathers torn, breathing shallow. A falcon limped away with a broken wing. Even Stormbreaker's own talons bled where they had raked against the wolves' hides. The alliance dispersed after the fight, each bird returning to its territory. But something had changed. Stormbreaker had proven that the high country could stand united when it had to, and that a leader's duty was not just to rule, but to protect all who lived under the same sky. The shadow that remains that night. As the wind whispered over the cliffs, Stormbreaker watched a dark line of the forest where the wolves had vanished. It knew the threat was not only driven away. The mountains were never truly safe, but they were worth fighting for, again and again, as long as there was breath in its lungs and strength in its wings. And somewhere deep in its chest, the old fire burned brighter than ever. The first snow came earlier than anyone in the high country expected. In years past, autumn lingered long enough for the valleys to fatten with prey before the cold closed its fist. But this year, winter swept in like an ambush. Within a single week, the meadows lay buried beneath a thick, unbroken sheet of white. The rivers crusted over with ice. Stormbreaker felt it in the wind-sharp dry, carrying the weight of a season that would be harsher than any it had known. The hunger season. In the early weeks, there was still food to be found. The streams at lower altitudes ran with slow-moving fish, and the occasional hare or vole left tracks across the snow. Stormbreaker hunted tirelessly, not just for itself but for the younger eagles who had less skill and stamina. But as the days shortened and the cold deepened, the land fell silent. Small prey vanished into burrows. The elk herds had long since migrated down into the foothills, far beyond easy reach. Even carrion was rare. Wolves and foxes picked clean whatever they killed. The sky grew emptier too. Some of the hawks and falcons who had once fought beside Stormbreaker left for warmer lands. Those who stayed grew lean, their feathers ragged from the cold. Signs in the snow. It was during a lonely patrol over the western valley that Stormbreaker found the first sign, a trail of deep, heavy prints cutting through the snow, moving with deliberate purpose toward the upper nesting cliffs. Wolves. The pack had returned. The prints were half filled with drifting snow, but Stormbreaker could tell from their spacing that the wolves were moving slowly, tired, hungry, but still dangerous. Worse, the trail led toward a cluster of nests where 2 young eaglets were still too small to fly. Stormbreaker's feathers prickled. The cold was killing enough. The wolves could not be allowed to take more. The blizzard's trap. That night, the wind began to howl with a voice that rose from the heart of the mountains. A blizzard rolled in, snow driving sideways, erasing the world beyond a few wingspans. The temperature plunged until even the air seemed brittle. It was in this chaos that the wolves struck. Stormbreaker sensed them before it saw them, shadows moving against the whiteness, shapes slipping between drifts and rocks. The blizzard masked their approach, allowing them to get dangerously close to the nesting cliffs. The younger eagles, trapped in their nests, cried out in fear. Their calls were nearly swallowed by the storm. Fight in the white silence. Stormbreaker launched into the blizzard, the cold burning its lungs. The snow made sight almost useless. It had to rely on sound and movement, reading the faintest shifts in the storm. The first wolf came into view as a flash of gray against the snow. Stormbreaker struck without hesitation, talons raking across its flank. The wolf yelped and tumbled into a drift, but two more surged forward. Wings beating hard, Stormbreaker fought to stay airborne in the slicing wind. It slashed at muzzles, dove at shoulders, using every ounce of strength to keep the predators from climbing higher toward the nests. For a moment, it seemed the wolves would break through. Then, through the snow, another shape appeared, broad wings, a familiar silhouette. Akila's eldest surviving pupil, now a powerful hunter in its own right, dove into the fight. Together they harried the wolves, forcing them back step by step until the pack leader snarled and turned away, retreating into the white void. The aftermath: when the storm finally eased at dawn, the valley lay buried in fresh snow. The wolves' tracks trailed off into the lower forests. The eaglets were safe, though their mothers clutched them close, eyes still wide from the night's terror. Stormbreaker roosted on a ledge above the cliffs, chest heaving from exhaustion. It knew the pack would return. Hunger made predators bold, and the winter was only beginning. The quiet resolve. That night, under a moon haloed by frost, Stormbreaker looked out over the silent expanse of the high country. Every instinct screamed that this winter would test them all, not just in strength, but in endurance. And in its heart Stormbreaker made a vow: as long as its wings could carry it, no predator, no storm, no hunger would claim the high country without a fight. Winter did not arrive in the high country like a guest, it came like a conqueror. Snow buried the meadows in a week, sealing the grass under a crust of ice that even the elk could not break. The rivers turned to pale stone, the life beneath their surfaces locked away in silence. The wind carried nothing but the sound of emptiness. And even the calls of the ravens, usually unshaken by cold, had grown rare. Stormbreaker felt it in its bones. Hunting became harder with each passing day. Hares and voles no longer left tracks. Deer and goats had migrated far down into the foothills. Carrion, when found, was stripped clean by wolves or foxes before an eagle could arrive. The sky itself seemed to hold less life. On the nesting cliffs, the situation was dire. 2 eaglets late hatched, and too young to hunt still depended on their mothers. The mothers themselves were growing weaker, their keel bones sharp beneath thinning feathers. If food didn't come soon, the high country would lose more than a season's brood. It would lose the next generation entirely. The choice. Stormbreaker stood on a wind-cut ledge one morning, scanning the valleys below. The air was sharp and dry, carrying no scent of prey. It remembered a lesson Aquila had spoken in years past. When the peaks go silent, follow the wind's memory. The rivers never forget. The elder's words pointed east, beyond the familiar ridges, toward a place where warmer currents might keep the water moving even in deep winter. Stormbreaker knew the journey would be long and dangerous, but the choice was simple: stay and watch the young starve, or fly into the unknown. It launched into the steel-gray sky, each wing beat slow and measured, conserving strength. The mountains gave way to open plains of snow, their flatness broken only by the black spines of spruce trees jutting from the drifts. The wind hissed across the crust, carrying with it the dry whisper of deep cold. The river. By midday, Stormbreaker found what it had been searching for. A wide river, mostly frozen, but with a narrow lane of open water curling along the bank. Steam rose where the current churned over stones, and in the dark water below, shadows moved. Fish, slow from the cold but alive. Fishing in such weather was punishing. The first dive broke through slush that clung to its wings like glue. The second caught nothing but a glint of ice. Only on the fourth strike did its talons close around a trout, the cold heft of it thrashing briefly before going still. Stormbreaker ate just enough to steady its muscles. The rest of the energy would go toward the true goal: feeding the high country, the raven's gift. As Stormbreaker rose from the riverbank, the air filled with the coarse calls of ravens. 3 of them circled down, black shapes cutting through the white glare. They landed at a respectful distance, heads cocked. One gave a familiar, rolling croak, the kind used not for warning, but for invitation. They lifted into the air and flew downstream, pausing to look back every few beats. Curious, Stormbreaker followed. Around a bend half buried in drift, lay the dark, frozen shape of an elk. Wolves had eaten their fill and moved on, leaving behind ribs, sinew, and thick strips of hide. For the hungry, it was treasure. Stormbreaker tore long, ropey bands of meat free, enough to carry but not so much that the weight would kill the flight home. It tucked the first strip into its talons and launched skyward, catching for survival. The journey back would take more than one trip. Stormbreaker cached some of the meat along the way, sliding a strip under a fallen spruce, another in the shadow of a boulder, burying them beneath snow so the scent would not draw scavengers. It marked each spot in its mind, not by sight but by the feel of the wind and the shape of the land. The first delivery to the cliffs came at dusk. The mother's eyes widened as the smell reached them. They fed their young before touching the meat themselves, and by the time they took their share, life had returned to their movements. Stormbreaker rested only briefly before setting out again, the meat run. The next days fell into a grueling rhythm. At first light, Stormbreaker flew to the caches, retrieved the strips, and carried them home. Then, it returned to the river or the elk carcass for more. The ravens often followed, sometimes leading it to new scraps. On the third day, Akila's eldest surviving pupil joined the effort, hauling meat with the steady power of one who understood the stakes. By the fourth day, a younger hunter fell into the pattern without being asked. It was no longer one eagle's work, it had become a lifeline. Clash in the open sky, not all threats came from the cold. On the fifth run, as Stormbreaker carried a strip of elk across the white plain, two bold eagles swept in from the south, winter visitors, bold and hungry. They cut in at angles meant to force it to drop the meat. Stormbreaker didn't waste energy in a drawn-out fight. Instead, it dropped lower, hugging the wind near the ground where the intruders struggled to follow. A sudden lift of the wing caught one off guard, raking its coverts just enough to send it reeling. The southerners broke off, and Stormbreaker carried the strip home unchallenged. The wolves eyed twice. The wolves tested the cliffs during this time, creeping close at dusk. But they found the defenders ready, well-fed enough to fly with precision, strong enough to hold the ledges. The scar-eyed leader lingered in the tree line once, watching for a long moment before fading back into the shadows. Stormbreaker knew this was only a pause, not a surrender. A change in the air by the second week. The difference in the high country was unmistakable. The eaglets no longer cried weakly, they begged with sharp, impatient calls. The mother's feathers regained their sheen. Even the younger hunters flew with cleaner lines, their dives sharper. The cold was still absolute, the snow still deep, but the cliffs had moved from the brink of disaster to a fragile balance. Enough for now. One night, as the moon turned the snowfields to silver, Stormbreaker perched on the highest spur, looking over the sleeping valley. The wind curled around its feathers, whispering the same truth the elder had once spoken. Home is not a place you keep, it is a practice you repeat. The long hunger was not over, but for now, the high country had enough. And in winter, enough is its own kind of victory. At first, the change came in whispers. The snow's deep winter blue began to pale, as if the cold itself were thinning. The air, still sharp, carried a new scent of dampness beneath the frost. Tiny rivulets formed in the shadows, trickling over rock before freezing again at night. The rivers, long silenced under ice, began to murmur through narrow black seams. The high country was still gripped by winter's hand, but Stormbreaker could feel the shift. The mountains were waking, and when they woke, they always woke hungry. The dangerous promise of Thor was never gentle here. It was a season of contradictions, relief and danger, abundance and loss. Snowmelt could feed the valleys, but it could also bring avalanches and floods. Slopes that had been solid for months could collapse without warning, and predators took advantage of the chaos. Stormbreaker read the signs in the wind. The air was warmer, but restless. The snow under its talons no longer rang with the hollow note of deep fries, it sagged, heavy with water. Each morning more bare rock showed on the south-facing slopes, and with it came the movement of prey. Goats edging out to graze the first green shoots, marmots testing the surface for safety, herds adjusting their paths through the passes. And with them, inevitably, came the wolves. The scar-eyed leaders returned. The pack had survived the long hunger. Stormbreaker saw them first as shadows sliding between the trees below the western ridge. 8 wolves in all, the scar-eyed leader, leaner but still powerful, 2 restless yearlings, a pregnant female moving cautiously, and the rest seasoned hunters with the measured gait of experience. They were not prowling aimlessly. They were mapping, testing. The western pass was their target, a narrow saddle between 2 cliffs that funneled prey into a space where a few swift moves could yield multiple kills. In deep winter, the snow there had been frozen solid, too dangerous even for wolves. But now, with the thaw softening the surface, it had become a trap they could exploit. Stormbreaker knew what that meant. If the pack took the pass, the goat herds and smaller grazers would be slaughtered in numbers the high country couldn't afford. The call for allies. This was not a fight for one eagle alone. Stormbreaker needed speed, distraction, and precision all at once. From a high anvil of rock, it sent out the call, not just a cry, but a layered signal carried on the wind, shaped in the language of the mountains. Allies came. Aquila's eldest surviving pupil arrived first, his shoulders broad and wings steady from seasons of hard flights. The scar-lipped female, feared for her ruthless dives, swept in next. Two younger hunters who had proven themselves during the long hunger joined, eager but disciplined. Even a red-tailed hawk answered, sharp-eyed and quick, along with a trio of ravens who cackled and preened as if they had already won. Together they formed a loose circle above the ridge, while Stormbreaker traced the plan in the air. The hawk and ravens would harass the wolves' flanks. Breaking their formation, the younger eagles would disrupt the snow shelf above the pass. The veterans would strike where the leader moved, not to kill but to blind and disorient. The goal was simple: shatter the pack's momentum, before they could force the herd into the choke point. The clash at the pass. The goats came first, horns, clattering hooves kicking up slush. The wolves followed, silent and relentless. The scar-eyed leader guided them with precise movements, pressing the herd toward the narrow spine of the pass. Stormbreaker let them come. Timing was everything. When the leader began his final push, the redtail swooped in, snapping at a yearling's ear before darting away. The wolf stumbled, throwing the formation off. Above, the younger eagles raked their talons across the weakened snow shelf, sending a sheet tumbling down. It struck the outer edge of the pack, forcing them to stagger and lose ground. Then the ravens arrived, hopping, flapping, yanking at tails and ears, filling the air with a racket that gnawed at the wolves' focus. Stormbreaker and the scar-lipped female dove together. They didn't strike the body, they struck the leader's vision. One pass, then another, talons slicing close enough to water his eyes and blur his sight. For a heartbeat, the pack was no longer one organism but scattered parts, each reacting alone. The goats seized the moment, veering away from the deadly funnel. In seconds, the advantage was gone, and the wolves knew it. The flood surprised just as the pack began to retreat. The mountain played its own card. Upstream, an ice dam shattered, sending a surge of meltwater down the valley. The river swelled, dragging chunks of ice like battering rams. Two goat kids, panicked, slipped into the current. Stormbreaker plunged without hesitation, bracing against a half-submerged willow. It intercepted the first kid, shoving it toward a gravel bar. The scar-lipped female saved the second, using her body to push it toward shallower water. Even the ravens joined in, perching on branches and calling in urgent, arrow-like gestures that seemed to guide the frightened animals. By the time the water calmed, the herd was safe and the wolves were gone, fading into the tree line. The lesson of the thaw, the pass remained in the high country's control, but Stormbreaker knew this was only a pause. The scar-eyed leader would be back, and next time he might come with new tactics. Still, for now, the cliffs were safe, the herds intact, and the rivers free of death. As the sun set over the ridges, turning the meltwater to ribbons of gold, Stormbreaker stood on the saddle, watching the snowfields soften in the evening light. Thaw was not peace, it was change, and in the high country, change was always the beginning of the next trial. The mountains shed their winter skin in waves. What had been white for months turned patchwork dark rock, breaking through snowfields, valleys greening first along the streams, slopes brushed with the gold of early flowers that seemed too delicate for such a harsh place. The air softened, carrying the scents of wet earth, pine sap, and the musk of returning herds. For the first time in many moons, the high country no longer felt like a fortress under siege, it felt alive again. Stormbreaker, perched on the tallest spur of the nesting cliffs, watched the change as if reading a familiar book from a new page. Summer was coming, and with it, a season of teaching. The young take to the air, the eaglets born in the teeth of winter were now nearly full. Their down had given way to dark, sturdy feathers. Their eyes burned with restless light. They hopped from branch to branch, wings half spread, testing the wind with clumsy beats. Every gust that rattled the nests seemed to stir an urge in them to leap, to leave. But the air is an unforgiving teacher, and eaglets are fearless before they are wise. Stormbreaker remembered his own first flights, how the ground had dropped away like a secret being revealed, how the air had been at once friend and stranger. He also remembered the falls, the sudden loss of lift, the crashes into branches and snow. He would not let these young ones meet the sky unprepared. Lessons in the sky. Training began at dawn. Stormbreaker would lead them along the cliff edge, encouraging them to feel the currents with their wings, to tilt just so when the wind shifted. He taught them to rise on thermals instead of fighting upward, to dive without folding too soon, to use their tails as rudders in tight turns. The scar-lipped female joined the lessons, demonstrating hunting dives. Aquila's eldest pupil showed them how to read the shadows on the ground for prey movement. The younger hunters, once students themselves, became patient mentors, guiding fledglings back to safety when they drifted too far. The first flights were short and clumsy. One eaglet nearly spiraled into the rocks below, saved only by a last-minute gust that Stormbreaker had seen coming. Another landed awkwardly in a spruce. Feathers puffed in embarrassment while the ravens laughed from a nearby branch. But each day, they grew steadier. Fearlessness began to blend with skill. Abundance and its dangers. Summer brought prey in plenty: trout in the rivers, marmots sunning on boulders, even the rare ptarmigan nesting in the meadows. The young eagles learned to hunt on the wing, to strike fish with precision, to snatch a vole before it reached its burrow. Their muscles strengthened, their reactions sharpened. Yet abundance had its own dangers. Well-fed predators roamed the valleys, foxes bold enough to test the nests, hawks looking to drive the young from their territory, and in the high air above the ridges, strangers appeared, migrating eagles from distant ranges, large and territorial, willing to challenge even seasoned hunters for a choice fishing spot. Stormbreaker intercepted one such intruder, massive female from the north whose wings beat with heavy power. Their battle was brief but fierce, a clash of talons and buffing wing strikes that sent feathers spiraling into the updrafts. Stormbreaker drove her off, but not before the young had seen what defending the sky truly meant. A lesson in loss. One bright afternoon, a fledgling took a dive after a hare in the meadow below the cliffs. It was too steep, too fast, and the wind at ground level was fickle. The eaglet missed the hare, clipped a rock outcrop, and tumbled hard into the grass. By the time Stormbreaker reached it, the young one was breathing shallow, a wing bent at the wrong angle. The mothers and pupils gathered, silent. In the high country, injury often means the end. There are no healers but time, and time is not merciful to the weak. For days, Stormbreaker stayed near the fledgling's resting perch, bringing small catches, shielding it from harsh weather. But on the fourth night, it slipped quietly into stillness. The loss weighed heavily, not just for what it was, but for the reminder. The sky gives and the sky takes, and no leader can protect against every fall. The summit flight. By midsummer, the surviving fledglings were strong. Stormbreaker decided they were ready for the summit fleeter, right older than memory, where young eagles follow their elders to the highest peak in sight, testing endurance, navigation, and courage. They launched at dawn, the world below still in shadow. The climb was long, the air thinning with every wingbeat. Some lagged, others surged ahead, but Stormbreaker kept the pace steady, guiding them through shifting currents and over sharp rising thermals. When they reached the peak, the entire high country spread beneath them, valleys green with summer, rivers flashing silver, distant snowfields gleaming in the sun. The fledglings cried out in exhilaration, their voices echoing from rock to rock. Stormbreaker let them take it in. This was not just a lesson in flight, it was a promise. The sky was theirs now, if they could keep it. The quiet before the next storm. As the young explored their new freedom, Stormbreaker perched on a crag, scanning the horizon. The scarred wolf had not been seen since the thaw, but Stormbreaker knew better than to believe he was gone. In the mountains, absence is only another kind of presence. For now, the air was warm, the prey was plentiful, and the sky was clear. But in the high country, peace was never permanent. Summer was an ascent, but every climb has its shadow. And somewhere beyond the ridges, the next trial was already gathering. Summer's warmth had settled deep into the high country. The rivers ran full and clear, carving silver lines through green meadows. The air was rich with the scent of pine, resin, and wildflowers, and prey moved openly. Herds of goats on the high ridges, marmots basking on sunlit stones, trout flashing beneath ripples. But even in abundance, Stormbreaker never stopped scanning the edges of the sky. The horizon was a place where danger often announced itself, not with sound, but with movement too small for the untrained eye. One afternoon he saw it, far to the south. Beyond the distant peaks, a dark shape glided against the pale blue, then another, and another. Their silhouettes were heavy and broad, their wing beats slow and deliberate. They were not migrating passers-by, they were coming with purpose. The intruders, by the time the sun touched the western ridge, 6 of them had arrived. They were eagles bigger than most in the high country, their plumage marked with pale mottling that spoke of another range. Their leader was a scar-necked male with a beak chipped at the tip and eyes like cold steel. They circled above the valley without descending, mapping it with their gaze. Stormbreaker recognized their formation. This was not a casual scouting party, it was a claim. They were testing the air, weighing the strength of the territory, deciding where to press. The next morning, they came lower. The first encounter, Stormbreaker rose from the nesting cliffs to meet them. He did not call the fledglings or the younger hunters. This first contact was not for them. In the High Country's code, territory disputes began with a conversation, sometimes brief, sometimes bloody. They met above the river flats, the intruders forming a wide half-circle, their leader at the center. "This range is rich," the Scarneck male said in the unspoken language of wing and posture. "We will hunt here." "This range is guarded," Stormbreaker answered, holding his altitude just above the leader's line. "Leave now." The leader tilted his head, as if amused. "You cannot guard every stream, every meadow. We take only what we can carry." "And when it is gone?" Stormbreaker asked. The other said nothing. His wings shifted, a subtle challenge. Stormbreaker knew the talk was over. Testing the defenses, the intruders did not attack outright. Instead, they began probing the edges of the territory, fishing in the northern lakes, chasing marmots on the open slopes, shadowing goat herds from a distance. When challenged, they would withdraw, only to reappear in another corner of the range. It was a slow pressure, designed to exhaust the defenders. Stormbreaker called a council on a high plateau. The scar-lipped female was blunt. "We strike them hard, now drive them past the ridges before they settle." Akila's eldest pupil was more cautious. "They're looking for weakness. If we fight on their terms, they'll bleed us slowly. Better to guard the key hunting grounds and let the rest go until they tire." Stormbreaker listened, weighing both paths. To fight everywhere was to stretch too thin. To yield ground was to risk losing it forever. The first skirmish, the decision was made for him a few days later. A pair of intruders cornered one of the fledglings over the western meadow. The young eagle dove for the trees, but the strangers cut him off, forcing him into the open sky. Stormbreaker and the scar-lipped female arrived in a rush of wind and fury. The fight was fast and vicious, talons clashing, wings buffeting. Stormbreaker struck one intruder across the back, sending him tumbling. The scar-lipped female drove the other into a dive so steep he barely pulled out before hitting the ground. They retreated, but not far. The message was clear. The intruders were willing to risk blood to test the High Country. Preparing for the storm that evening, Stormbreaker roosted on the tallest cliff, watching the intruders circle far off. He knew they would not leave on their own. This was no passing threat, this was an invasion. The young were strong now, but still learning. The hunting grounds were full, but could be stripped bare in weeks if 6 more mouths fed from them daily. And the wolves still roamed the valleys, their own hunger sharpening as summer waned. 2 fronts of danger, one from the ground, one from the air, were forming. If they converged, the High Country could be broken. Stormbreaker's eyes narrowed against the fading light. The next chapter of the mountain's story would not be about survival alone. It would be about war. The air before a storm has its own weight. Even without clouds, it presses on feathers and sharpens every sound. Stormbreaker felt it now, not from weather, but from the convergence of 2 predators. The intruding eagles still wheeled along the horizon, probing the range from above. Below, the scar-eyed wolf's pack was once again on the move, shadows threading between the trees and alpine meadows. Their trails pointed toward the western bulrich with goat herds and close to the nesting cliffs. If the 2 threats struck together, the High Country would bleed from both sky and ground. Stormbreaker knew there would be no second chance. This fight would decide not just the season, but the legacy of the cliffs themselves. A call across the peaks. That night, Stormbreaker sent his cry out into the dark. It carried far over ridges, down valleys, along the courses of rivers. It was not the call of a hunter, nor the warning of a sentinel. It was a summons. They came. Akila's eldest pupil, steady as the stone itself, the scar-lipped female, fierce and tireless. The younger hunters who had flown the meat runs through the long hunger. The red-tailed hawk, small but swift. And the 3 ravens who had proven time and again that cunning was as sharp as any talon. Even allies from beyond the range answered. A broad-winged eagle from the eastern cliffs to kestrels from the foothills, and a veteran golden eagle who carried the scar of an old trap on his leg, but still flew like a blade. They gathered on the high plateau under a half-moon. Stormbreaker mapped the plan in the language of wing and wind. The ground force, the wolves would be stopped in the narrow saddle of the western pass. The sky force, the intruders would be drawn into battle there, where their numbers and maneuverability would be broken by the cliffs and shifting currents. The key was timing. The 2 threats had to meet the defenders at the same moment, before either could break through. The wolves advanced at dawn. The wolves came first. The scar-eyed leader was leaner than before, but moved with the same cold precision. The yearlings flanked him, and the pregnant female hung back with a protective snap at any who crowded her. The rest moved in a low, silent run that ate the ground without pause. From above, Stormbreaker shadowed them, the wind under his wings whispering of the coming clash. At the same time, The intruding eagles began to close from the south, their formation tight, their leader the scar-necked male keeping to the highest line. They meant to sweep in after the wolves had forced the prey into the open. They would not have that chance. The battle begins. It started with Shadow. Stormbreaker plunged from the high thermals, striking the lead wolf across the muzzle. The scar-lipped female followed, raking another's flank. The wolves bunched instinctively, their rhythm broken. From the tree line the ravens erupted, diving at ears and eyes, pulling fur, filling the air with a chaos of cause. The red-tailed hawk darted in and out, feinting to scatter the yearlings. Then the intruders arrived. The scar-necked male dove at Stormbreaker from above, talons wide. Stormbreaker rolled mid-air, feeling the wind shear past his feathers as he countered. They locked for a heartbeat to sets of talons, to Willsby for breaking apart to circle again. All along the pass, the air filled with combat, bodies striking, wings buffeting, cries echoing off stone. The defenders fought with the precision of those who knew the land's every current. The intruders, though powerful, found themselves forced into tighter turns, their advantage of size blunted by the cliffs. Turning the tide, Aquila's eldest pupil drove one intruder into the rock wall, sending him spiraling down toward the snow. The veteran from the east took on two at once, forcing them higher until the thin air stole their strength. The kestrels harried the edges, darting in to slash at exposed wings. Below, the wolves made another push for the pass. The scar-eyed leader lunged for a goat caught on the outer edge, but Stormbreaker saw it and dove, striking the snow above the wolf's path. The shelf broke loose, avalanching into the gap and forcing the pack to scatter. The scar-eyed leader snarled, his one good eye locking on Stormbreaker. For a moment, predator met predator across the gulf between air and ground. Then, with a whip of his tail, the wolf turned downslope. The pack followed, their hunt broken. The final duel that left the scar-necked male. He came at Stormbreaker in a head-on charge, both climbing high before folding into a mutual dive. The air screamed past them, talons met in mid-fall, locking, twisting. They dropped together, each trying to throw the other off balance. At the last instant, Stormbreaker shifted, rolling under the larger bird and raking upward across his chest. The scar-necked male cried out, wings flaring wide to slow his fall. He righted himself but did not press the attack. Instead, he circled once, gave a sharp-clipped cry to his followers, and turned south. One by one, the intruders peeled away, retreating over the ridge until they were only dark specks against the bright sky. Aftermath silence settled over the pass, broken only by the wind and the distant bleating of goats regrouping. The defenders circled once in slow formation before landing along the ridges. Feathers were ruffled, talons blooded, but no lives had been lost. Stormbreaker stood on the highest point, scanning the valleys below. The wolves were gone for now. The sky was clear. The high country had survived. The weight of victory that night, under a full moon, the defenders roosted together, rare thing among eagles. The ravens dozed in a tight huddle, the hawk perched with one foot tucked under. The kestrels pressed close to the rock for warmth. The air was still, the stars sharp and bright. Stormbreaker did not sleep. He watched the horizon, knowing that threats would always return in one form or another. That was the way of the mountains. But for now, the cliffs were safe, the young could grow, and the legacy of the high country was unbroken. From tragedy to greatness, the journey was complete, not because the battles had ended, but because he had become what the sky needed. Stormbreaker spread his wings once, feeling the cool night air flow through his feathers, and let the wind carry the quiet promise forward. As long as I fly, this place will stand.